All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new. Thanks to everyone else for returning. Appreciate you giving a listen here. If you were around last week, I feel compelled to report that I think I jinxed myself. I was talking about what a good job I had done the previous week of keeping myself focused and my wits about me. Well, the forces that be decided to put that to the test this week. It was almost as if the universe was saying to me, "Oh, really, Mr. Podcast Guy who did such a good job last week? Well, let's see how you do with this." And let's just say I didn't fend as well. Been a bit of a rough week, and I've been managing as best I can. Some of the stuff I was talking about last week in terms of feeling like I'm up against a machine. I was talking about my daughter and the screen time on her phone. Well, that continues to be part of what's going on, I think, but it's bigger than that too. It's things that are happening in my immediate life like that with my daughter combined with this larger picture and general feeling of doom. Now, whether or not that feeling of doom is really warranted, or maybe that's just been conditioned on me if you watch the news even for like a couple of minutes. But I think I generally have two ways that I try to turn it around or address it for myself. One, as you know, if you listen to this show, I enjoy wallowing in the big ideas. Sometimes if I can hold a certain idea or value that I've contemplated and considered and it's well thought through, it gives me a certain something to go off of, to feel into what's happening. It's like a perceptual lens, and me having some say about that perceptual lens. Like, I don't have all the say. There's all these things that are just part of me that I don't have control of, or part of society that's been conditioned on me that I don't have control over. But there's some amount that I get to have a say in, and that's what yoga practice has always been about, is coloring that perceptual lens in a way that is more I would wish for. However, as I've also discussed here on the show, sometimes big ideas are not enough. That big ideas can sometimes actually obscure one's ability to feel things and be present in things. So I also look for very practical strategies, like what are things I can actually do today in an immediate, maybe more mundane way? What little patterns can I adjust to subtly alter the soup of how I'm feeling in my life right now? And a lot of times I can kind of shift it and get myself more on track with a small little change that seems like it isn't relevant to the thing that was stressing me out, if that makes sense. Like the thing that was stressing me out, the bigger question that I don't have any control over, that there's no real solution to, that's causing me anxiety. I can't do anything about that, but you know what? I can get off the screen in a more judicious manner. You know, I can have some discipline around the immediate things that I do and affect that perceptual lens, right? So I did manage to turn it around some, but it certainly feels like rough waters. And I have continued to use this show as a vehicle to see if I can garner support and resources and just help me find my way through all this stuff. And My talk today with Nate Klemp, I think, is a wonderful contribution to this cause. I did not know Nate before this conversation. You'll hear the genesis of the conversation came out of a PR email, and you know, I don't do that a lot, but every once in a while I do. And when I do, it's because there's a synchronicity or there's something that is connecting me to it. And it was certainly the case with Nate. He's got a book, I think it might be out or it's coming out very soon. It's called Open: Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World. And frankly, I clicked a link in the PR email and it went to a video that he had made promoting the book. And the video was all about what I was just talking about how are we going to find our way in this world where our attention is being held hostage. I don't know how to say it right, but Nate and I connected on some of this stuff and on some stuff with being in a marriage and I think most importantly, finding some real clear strategies and ideas that might help us take some immediate steps forward rather than wallowing in just the big ideas. So it was very cool to connect with Nate, and I'm glad that I get to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to that, I have an announcement. We have released a new offering that I'm excited about, and I consider it to be the next evolution of what I have produced when it comes to on-demand yoga videos. Back in 2013, my partner Josh and we produced a yoga DVD that was taking what I was doing as a teacher, the program of asana and the practice principles I was utilizing. And we took that and we made it into a video product that had the practice in 5 different lengths: 7 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and 75 minutes. And it was intended to be a tool for someone who didn't live where I lived and couldn't come to my yoga center to have a video that they could use to develop a personal practice at home. And I'm happy to say that a lot of people benefited from that. And a few years later, I had been traveling all around and doing these weekend intensive workshops, basically 2 days, 2 sessions a day, 3 hours each, like a 12-hour workshop. And after doing that for a couple years, we decided to produce a video of that. And if you remember, if you've been around on the show listening for long enough, you'll remember that the way that we produced it is we did a contest here on the show. And I said, anybody listening who wants to do a free workshop with me and can come to this location at this time, you can come become part of my filming of the online version of the workshop. So many of you listening might have been people who took that online workshop, Gentle is the New Advanced, and that was the next thing that we made. And it's been some years since then, but in 2021, I recorded 36 module videos as part of the process of developing my teacher training program. It became one of the components of the training, but these 36 module videos, in my mind, are really an expansion of the conversations I was having in the online workshop. So anybody who's been to my workshop before or done the online workshop, if you got something from that, these module videos, in my mind, are the full story of that. Those were very abbreviated lectures that I gave. So these 36 module videos really open it up. It's really where I have gotten clarity on what I know about yoga, where I got it from, and really the principles of practice that have held true for me, like the history and philosophy stuff, as well as the asana, pranayama, meditation, all of it. To me, these 36 module videos is the most comprehensive thing I've ever managed to record and put out there. So we took those 36 module videos and we combined it with my practice videos and some accompanying questions and exercises, and we created this course. If you are someone who's already a yoga teacher and you need to satisfy your continuing education credits, it counts for 30 hours of CECs. But really more than that, if you're someone who wants to learn about yoga in a deeper way, but doing a year-long teacher training is just too much to bite off, or you just can't do any more Zoom meetings, then this on-demand course, I think, is for you. Again, it's called the Yoga Modules, and it is available now. I encourage you to go check it out. You can find it along with all of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, that's it for now. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Nate Klemp. Hello?
Hello, Jay. How you doing?
Hi, Nate. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too.
I don't know how familiar you are with this show, but let me mention I'm already recording, and if it's okay with you, I want us to consider ourselves having just begun.
Let's go. I love it.
Very, very cool. Well, I am glad to get to meet you, and I want to start by just sharing something with you because I do think it kind of sets us up for what I think we might talk about today, which is that, frankly, I get a fair amount of emails of people looking to see if I might be interested in having them on the show. And very few of those emails end up leading to someone coming on the show. Not because they're not like great people or doing great things. It's just, it has to sync up in a way with like where I'm at or like where my muse is taking me for it to make sense, And sometimes I file them away for other times. But yours synced up quite good, like in an uncanny way that made me feel like, all right, I feel like maybe I should have Nate on. And I'd say there's a couple areas, but like the overarching area was that on this show, people who listen to it know I sort of oscillate back and forth between really wanting to kind of analyze things and really get into like the philosophical underpinnings of things, because I feel like a lot of decisions that get made, whether it's like in a yoga class or in like someone's life, often do come from like a worldview that someone holds. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that we've been exploring in terms of intuition or like certain aspects of our somatic experience that you really can't think your way into. And sometimes trying to analyze or find words for these things can be helpful, can actually, invite people in and lead people in good directions. And sometimes it can almost seem like it almost obfuscates things that are very natural and normal to us. And I would also say that this runs concurrently with an ongoing thread for me personally around just like screen addiction and having certain boundaries around that and really making like a practice of being in the woods. So in any case, all of this comes to when I get your email and I take a quick look at your bio and it shows that you went to Stanford and Princeton and had like degrees in, philosophy and political philosophy. And then there was this one statement at the end where it said that the goal of realizing human flourishing could not be achieved through philosophy. Yep. And I thought, isn't that true? So I guess to get us started, why do you think that is? What do you think's missing from philosophy that it needs to be found in other aspects of our experience in other areas?
You're right. That one statement has a pretty huge backstory to it. And the backstory.
Please share. That's what I'm getting at. I love to hear the backstory to that statement because it stood right out to me. I was like, "Ooh, totally. What's that?"
That one line has a lot of juice to it. For me, when I went to college, I had two things I loved. One was jazz. One was philosophy. I made the pragmatic choice to become a philosopher. I thought that was a better career path, if you can believe that. And so I studied philosophy. And I got my undergraduate degree and a master's degree. And then I realized if I wanted to become a professional philosopher, I had to get a PhD. So I ended up doing a PhD, which took 5 years. And I got to the end of what was basically a decade of just like super intense philosophical training, where I was spending 12, 13 hours a day in the library reading all the great texts, writing a dissertation, all those things. And the stress of that, coupled with, I had this bike accident during my final year of graduate school where I got a concussion, and my mind and body started to fall apart in a way that I had never experienced before. I had this just crazy moment of realization at the end of that, which was my goal in all of this philosophical reflection was to learn how to live the good life and ask the big questions. And here I was at the end of this process where I had gone as far as one could go, and my life was actually far worse than it was at the beginning. I was actually at a low point. And so paradoxically, I both had the realization that you're talking about, that there's a way in which we can't think our way to certain experiences in the body, realization, certain states of awareness. But there was also this imperative at the time to figure out how to deal with what was happening in my mind and body. And so I had the really good fortune of getting my first tenure track position in Malibu in 2008 and just fell into the LA yoga scene right away. I had never really done much yoga, but I was looking for something like yoga, and yoga just kind of found me. And so that's where I ended up down in Venice.
Were you at Yoga Works?
Exhale and just, yeah, Yoga Works. I went to Yoga Works quite a bit. So it was this really amazing kind of path that led me to things like yoga and meditation.
Well, I grew up in Los Angeles in the suburbs, but we would spend our summers taking the beach bus over to Malibu. However, I was really not into yoga at all when I was growing up. It wasn't until I left and went to New York. But there was that sort of twin poles happening on the East Coast and West Coast as yoga kind of crashed into the mainstream. I guess, was there a moment when you were like, oh, this academic pursuit, like a crisis of purpose? When did that happen? When did you know that, oh, I don't want to just go be a tenured professor? Was there some clear moment where that was obvious to you?
Yeah, I think the deeper I went into these various practices, the more I started to realize that my vision of philosophy, it wasn't that I wanted to leave philosophy, but I was creating a new vision that was really different from what I was supposed to do. As a professor, you're supposed to publish articles and you're supposed to get tenure. But my vision was to go back to this tradition that's often called living philosophy. People in this tradition include, some of the Greek philosophers like Plato, but also the transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau, where he spends 2 years and 2 months at Walden Pond. It's not a book about philosophy, really. It's a book about one person trying to understand what happens when we come into direct contact with nature in the present moment. And so it became really clear that's where I wanted to go. And it also became really clear that the institution was not at all designed for that. And so I actually took a leave and started this crazy blog called Life Beyond Logic, where I would live philosophical ideas for a week and report on my experiences all throughout LA. And that was kind of the moment where I think I realized I'm probably not tenure material, and I left after 4 years. And the rest of my life has really just been about exploring and understanding these practices and writing about them and setting up experiences in my own life that are almost designed to see what happens at the edges of some of these ideas when we put them into contact with real life.
Well, I think that's an interesting point about them being in contact with real life. It's one thing to sit around and kind of contemplate things, which I think has certainly been useful to me. I kind of need that. My mind needs it, but it's not the same thing as then being present with my wife,
Exactly.
But it's also interesting to hear the timing of what happened for you, because, I remember I opened a yoga center in Williamsburg, Brooklyn in 2007, and I was very active in the blogosphere as well. I had a blog that I was writing for 10 years. And there was that period of time right in there, 2010, especially, where there was quite a bit happening, like the online world of exchange around yoga and meditation or whatnot was kind of vibrant. I remember meeting all kinds of people and like common threads. And I often talk about that here on the show, and a lot of people listening weren't around for it, but it sounds like you were.
I was, and it's been fun listening to some episodes with Rod Stryker and some of the other folks you've had on, and seeing that common thread. Because for me, that really was the time where I was introduced to people like Sean Korn and Saul David Ray and Rod Stryker and some of the spiritual teachers who were near LA and Ojai, like Byron Katie and Gay and Katie Hendricks. And so for me, that time was just, it was like this whole new world opened up to me that as an academic, I would have thought prior to living in LA, you know, what a bunch of crazy spiritual woo-woo stuff. But the timing was right. The life circumstances were right. And so, yeah, that was a really fertile period for me anyway.
Yeah, and I guess it is interesting too, because one of the conversations I've been having most recently here on this show has a lot to do with sort of like a post-lineage time in yoga where we don't have like the same sources for like authority or like credentials, you know, like having academic credentials is one thing and it carries a certain weight. But in the kind of realm that we're talking about, it used to be, you know, guru masters. And nowadays, I do think it's much more, there's been a lot of hybriding and people really, you know, taking from a lot of different sources and putting them together. I suppose in what you're doing in your work, I don't know if, do you think of yourself more as a coach or more as a teacher? Do you kind of align yourself with certain traditions? You said this living philosophy tradition. Have you thought about like how much of it is coming from teachers you had and how much of it is coming out of your own like improvisatory creative space that you're kind of facilitating with people?
I think you make a really good point. You're right that this is an inflection point. And it seems to me that a lot of the original teachers, both in the world of mindfulness and yoga, they had a really clear lineage and like one teacher or one tradition that they were coming out of. And I've always almost like shamed myself for not having that. You know, that I should have this.
I think a lot of people, yes.
Yeah, like I should have this clear, you know,
or you're a fraud because you're not legit. You're not legit.
Or I only do Dzogchen, Tibetan meditation or something like that. But for me, I guess it's just never really been on the menu. I've always had an interest in all these different ideas and different traditions. And I guess I consider myself mostly a writer. And in my writing, I just think it's really interesting to almost play jazz with all of these different traditions. And I know there are traps there and there are risks there because it's not going as deep perhaps into a single tradition. But I also just think that for me, that's like the intuitive path. And if I think about even in the 19th century, what was happening in America with people like Thoreau and Emerson, you know, they were doing the same kind of thing. They were reading Plato and they were reading the Bhagavad Gita and kind of like exposed to all these different traditions. And what made them interesting is they were synthesizing all of this together into something new, which became American Transcendentalism. So I like just going back to that historical moment to think like, well, maybe that's what we're doing too. We're creating new traditions that are a synthesis of all these amazing tools.
Yeah. And I suppose, and this is my experience, and I'm curious what it might relate to yours, is that there was a moment in my pursuit of like wanting to contemplate the nature of my existence where it became obvious that the pursuit was pulling me out of my life rather than bringing me into my life. And at some point it became more important to like have partnership. And I'm not saying that that should be true for everybody, but for me it was. And like I wanted to have a family. And so much of what has been like the proving ground of my practice or my ideas is like whether or not my life is going okay. And I noticed that your book before your most recent one, which we can get to, on living with an expansive mind in a distracted world, was a book about marriage, the 80-80 marriage plan. And I guess I'm curious how much of your work is tied into your personal life and how much of it is, I mean, how could it be separate?
Yeah, I really resonate with you in what you're saying about having certain life demands that take you in a particular direction, which on the face of it, maybe isn't going on the deepest spiritual path, but ends up being like a really transformative, powerful experience. And for me, I think similar to you, having a marriage, having a child, kids, was a really wild experience. And especially because in my marriage, it got off to a really terrible start. We actually got married right before that bike accident I told you about. And so we entered a very dark period, almost got a divorce. And so for me, having been trained as a philosopher, it started to become just really interesting at a certain point to think philosophically about the things that were happening in our life. And one of those things was this question of how do we create a relationship in this modern world where the models of our parents and our grandparents don't really apply to us, where we have this commitment to being equals and in love, but what does that mean? Like, what are the underlying principles for this? And so yeah, I think, I really resonate with just this idea that our life is the practice. And so whatever happens in life, whether that's getting married or having kids or health challenges that we're experiencing, we could see it as a distraction from the practice, or we could see it as the practice itself. Mm-hmm. And I try to just remind myself of that a lot, that this is the practice. Whatever is happening is the practice.
It certainly is. And I do also want to take a moment to spend a little bit of time on this idea of an 80-80 marriage plan, just even if it's not a marriage, in terms of relationships, and even in terms of the idea of equality, which I think is kind of almost a hot button idea in this day and age for some reason. But maybe you could lay out for people listening who aren't familiar with this idea of an 80-80 marriage plan. What's the difference between an 80-80 and a 50-50 and an 80-20? Can you lay that out real quick for people?
Yeah, well, here's the quick framework. So think back to the 1950s, maybe that's your grandparents, great-grandparents. The prevailing model was what we call the 80-20 model, where one partner, usually the woman, carries about 80% of the load of the relationship, and the other partner, usually the man, does about 20%. Most of us have evolved beyond that construct and are in what we would call more of the 50-50 paradigm of marriage. And what that means is we acknowledge, at least on the surface, that we're equals. That doesn't mean the distribution is equal when it comes to, childcare,
the dishes,
work.
Who's doing the dishes?
Yeah, exactly. Like women still do more, statistically speaking, but the aspiration is at least toward equality. And I think that's a great thing. But one of the traps of that mindset is this idea that the way forward in marriage is to see if we can make everything in our marriage and life perfectly 50-50 fair. And we're going to keep a scorecard of like all the amazing contributions I do juxtaposed against my partner's contributions. And if we can just hit that point of perfect fairness, everything's going to be amazing. And so the idea behind an 80-80 marriage is saying that is a trap for all sorts of reasons. There's all sorts of studies in psychology showing that we tend to overestimate what we do, underestimate what our partner does. But that there's a better mindset, which is, hey, what if we both strive to do far more than our fair share, contribute at 80%? We're not actually going to reach it. The math doesn't work. But there's a possibility of shifting from this aspiration toward fairness to something that's, I think, much more productive, which is what we call radical generosity.
Well, I love that. And I think, to me, it's interesting when I think of the 80-20 model of my parents, maybe, it is quite generational, even in the sense that, like, I changed way more diapers than my dad ever did. But I think the reason why that distribution was like that was because there was a certain amount of value placed on like doing this stuff around home, cleaning and taking care of kids, and then a certain amount of value on like, I pay for all of this because I bring home the bacon. And I think that dynamic certainly changed. Certainly not true in our relationship. There's times where my wife was bringing in more of the money, and then there's been times when I've been bringing in more of the money. So we never really had that. But I do think we've come up against what you said, this idea that everything needs to be 50-50. And that really doesn't work, because there's certain things that like I just don't mind doing as much as she does. And there's certain things that she doesn't mind doing that I hate doing. And it just seems like the key, what it seems like, and you'll tell me if I'm right, that the idea of 80-80, because as you said, the math doesn't necessarily work, is more of like a mindset and like a kind of a level of communication. Because the more we both feel good about it, like, you know, she hates calling the insurance companies, so I'll call the insurance companies, but I don't want to have to call the school when they're late, or, you know what I mean? Like, we've delineated it enough to where we both feel that we're pulling our weight. And if we're not feeling that, if we feel like the other person isn't pulling our weight, we're going to definitely tell each other. And that seems to me more of what 80-80 is about, really, than keeping score.
Absolutely. And you're right that it's a mindset. And, you know, one of the things I hear sometimes is like, oh, well, that's just a mindset. What's that going to do? And I think I always like to push back on that, because I think, and I think this comes out in the research too, that your mindset is actually contagious, especially in a relationship. So if you're approaching your partner with a mindset of everything's got to be 50-50 fair, and if you don't do your fair share, I'm going to resent you, that mindset becomes contagious. Your partner gets entered into the game, they're going to resent you too. If, on the other hand, your mindset is more of, hey, I'm going to strive to contribute at 80%, I'm going to strive toward this mindset of radical generosity, that actually paradoxically may play out in your best interest, because there's a contagious quality to generosity. Like, the more generous you are toward your partner, the more generous they will likely be toward you. And it can kind of create this upward spiral. So even if only one person is doing it, it can still be a really powerful practice.
And I feel like it's easier said than done.
Yes, yes. That should be the caveat at the very beginning.
Speaking of like ideas and whether or not they come into actuality. So what do you think are some of like the obstacles to having a more radical generosity in our lives?
Well, I think the fairness trap is where I would start.
Right.
I think just basic mindfulness is a big trap. So, you know, we get locked in certain patterns and habits, and often we just don't even see that they're happening in real time. So becoming aware is in some ways the radical moment where you realize, wait a minute, there's an alternative strategy here for me. And then the other thing I would say is there's this assumption that a lot of couples have that everything should just kind of work out perfectly by accident. We call it the wing it approach. So for example, with like the division of roles in any relationship, most couples we interview will say, yeah, we just kind of decided to wing it. Like, we never really thought about it one way or the other. And as a result, my wife ends up doing everything. I don't do enough. We're in conflict all the time. So like, one of the most powerful things is actually really simple, to just bring some intentionality to it. And if we're talking about something like our roles in the relationship, to actually have a conversation. Hey, what would the best structure of roles be for us? And that's actually a conversation that a surprisingly small number of couples will ever have.
I think that's so true. That's what I was talking about before in terms of communication, because we certainly winged it at first too. I think most people do. There's not like a lot of good models, especially when your parents weren't good communicators or whatever.
Exactly.
But at some point, I think for myself, and also my wife's just like an incredibly honest person. That's why I'm with her. And I think at a certain point, we both, when things didn't feel right, we both wanted to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I see even in like people I know and even other members of my family, where there just isn't that, there isn't that avenue for communication. So it doesn't ever get discussed. And no one, you know, my wife, it's hard. It's an interesting thing. We were joking about the dishes, but it's hard for me to grasp that me not doing enough dishes makes my wife feel like I don't respect her. Like that's like, I was like, it took me a while to get it, but at a certain point, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's how she feels. I don't want her to feel that way. Of course I respect her. So you got to work it out. And that's the thing. If you do talk about it and you love each other, then I think a lot of times it can be worked out. At least it has been so far for us. I'm going to knock on a little wood.
Yeah, well, I just applaud you and your wife for having those conversations, because I think that is the key, the communication. And for a lot of people, there's this block that's basically discomfort, that it feels uncomfortable to have some of those hard conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a choice that then happens that, well, we're just not going to talk about that. And so what a cool thing that you've been able to have those conversations. It sounds like it's been really powerful for the two of you.
Yeah, it has. I mean, not easy, like you said, not necessarily comfortable.
Exactly.
But I also think that it's not just true for couples in marriage right now. Like being able to talk about things feels like strained now more than ever.
Absolutely.
And you know, I have 2 daughters. You mentioned you have children. How old are your children?
I have a 12-year-old daughter.
Okay. I have
a
13-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old daughter.
Okay, so we're kind of in the similar age, beginning of the teenage, adolescent years.
See, now I know why you wrote a book about trying to live in a distracted world, because you got a 12-year-old too.
Oh my gosh, yes. Just yesterday, I was driving her home from school. She was on her Apple Watch, because I won't give her a smartphone yet. And this is now, it's not only my problem, it's my family's problem. You know, it keeps escalating, getting bigger.
It really does. And you know, I've talked about it on the show some too, where we held off letting her have a phone. She had a watch, but it was literally just a phone watch, not even a smart watch, you know? Back when they had those for kids, you remember, before everything went totally. Well, so we held off till like, I don't know, maybe a few months after she turned 13. We gave her a phone, but with all kinds of strict controls, no social media apps, you know? And then she went to high school, and, you know, she came in and basically did like a PowerPoint presentation to convince us why she needed Snapchat. And you know what? It was legit, because like the student council that she was part of, the chorus, the orchestra that she's in, they all use it for communications.
Yeah.
So she really did have a legit case. But honestly, as soon as we did it, you could see what happened. And there's some pretty dystopian aspects of the way kids interact with each other on Snapchat. I've talked about it on the show, I guess. So do you think there's something unique that we are facing now because of the digital world that you and I weren't facing when we were 13?
I think there is. And I think even just having had the reference point of what a life would feel like without all of these technologies as a teenager is something I worry my daughter will never have, right? Like, I can think back to the mid 1990s when, sure, I had a TV that had MTV and I had my compact disc player, but I also had all of these moments of idle time, almost boring time. And so I do worry that there's a generation of kids, of which our kids are a part of, that just they don't have the reference point. Reality is almost inherently mitigated through screens. And so I don't know where that will take us, but I certainly am trying with my daughter, using a bunch of different tactics to give her at least moments of that alternative reality where life isn't mediated through a glowing glass rectangle.
Well, I will say that I'm like one of the only parents of her friend group who even has like screen time settings on there.
Right.
And I think sometimes people, it's just like, people aren't tech savvy and are intimidated by, and it isn't that easy. You know, you do got to read it and figure out how to set it up, but you can put controls on what they can do. So she has to ask me for more time or ask me if she can put anything on there, you know? And I've been kind of shocked by how few parents seem concerned.
Yeah, I think that for some reason, in my mind, this is the most obvious problem of our time. I mean, the fact that our attention is being drawn in all these different directions, and not just that we're distracted, but that we crave distraction. And yet I'm having the same experience as you, where there are many girls in my daughter's class who are 12 years old who lied about their age and are now on Instagram and Snapchat. And so their parents effectively endorsed a form of fraud for them to get onto these platforms, right? Like lying about their basic information. So I agree. And that's part of what drew me to having this conversation is I feel like even though it may be obvious to some of us, it's actually not that obvious. We live in a society where these technologies are now just a part of the way we live, and we're not taking a step back to reflect on their impact.
I know. And I think that part of that is because people, I'm not excluding myself from this. I mean, I drift in and out. You're kind of in triage survival mode of sorts. And if you're not distracting yourself, you have to like face stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like difficult, painful things inside yourself or the horrible situation of the world. And that's not easy.
Yeah. And I think that's part of why I've been drawn to this as a topic, is that here we are both people who are really intentional about training our mind and body to be more present and putting up safeguards in our lives to make sure that we're not carried away by distraction all the time. And it really hit me a few years ago where here I was meditating every day and doing yoga, and I had all these clever screen time tactics that I was using, and I could still just feel this urge or this like craving deep inside of me for various forms of distraction. For me, it's like news, the ESPN, the Denver Broncos, they're my local football team.
Nowadays it's out of control. It can be like dog grooming videos or people building tiny houses and U-Haul trucks. There's so much shit on YouTube. It's crazy.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like everybody has their own weird idiosyncratic list of like different, whatever, Twitter.
Yeah, like guilty pleasures, like those reality TV shows that people like to watch or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I thought, wow, if people like you and me, who we spend all day, every day, we built our careers on this idea of managing our attention more skillfully, if we're still having this problem, then this is a real problem. And it shows that there's a way in which we've lost like a basic sense of freedom. I think of freedom as the ability to choose what we want to pay attention to, or the ability to spend our time and attention on what matters. And if that's freedom, then I think we could all fairly say that our screens have taken some percentage of that freedom away. And I think it's interesting then to think like, okay, well, how do we get that back?
Okay, how do we? Or what are some of your strategies that you're using that seem to be working?
Yeah, well, I'll just tell you some of my strategies specifically on screen addiction that have been helpful for me. So there's this whole literature in habit formation about environmental design or behavioral architecture. The basic idea being, can we design the spaces we inhabit such that the things that are important to us are relatively easy to do, friction-free, the things that are distractions or that we don't want to focus on, that there's some sort of a form of friction there. So for me, one element of this is like, what's the design of my living space? So kicking my phone and my wife's phone out of our bedroom, that was like a first step. No brainer. Amazing. Life-changing. Having a place.
And just to jump in, sorry to interrupt you, but for me, it was as simple as before I go to bed, I put my laptop and my phone downstairs.
Yes.
So at the very least, I have to get out of bed and go downstairs before I can get it. At the very least.
Exactly. And people say like, well, how am I going to know when to wake up? My alarm's on my phone. Well,
Get another alarm clock.
you get an alarm clock. Yeah, it's $5. I have a Fitbit. It's got a little vibrating alarm on it. You know, there's a lot of ways you can wake up.
Yeah.
But that I think is the starting point. And then there are a bunch of other things you can do. One is the design of the device itself. You were talking about like focus mode and screen time mode, stuff like that can be really useful. Silencing all your non-essential notifications. I set up my home screen so that none of my distracting apps are on it. In fact, I put them like 5 screens away, you know, where you have to swipe.
Yeah, you know,
to the other screens.
It's funny you bring that up. I haven't done this myself because I don't have as much of an issue with this, I don't think. But like, I know a friend who has like a minimalist thing that they put on their phone where literally there's no icons. It's just like a black screen with a list of words, like text names. So there's no weird icons. It's just this minimalist list of what's on your phone. I'm like, oh, isn't that interesting? And that person's very young, I should add, like in their 20s. And I was like totally intrigued that someone in their 20s had chose to do that with their phone. And she specifically told me that looking at the icons and gives her anxiety.
Yeah, like those red numbers that come up when you have email or text.
Anybody who still has push notifications where your phone is dinging at you when things happen, I don't know how people do that. It's like crazy. Turn that shit off.
You got to get rid of that. The breaking news alerts. I knew somebody who got an alert every time they got an email. That's just insanity. I don't know why you would do that. Yeah. But here's one other thing that has actually been a big deal for me. It's about designing my time such that I have scheduled time for distraction. And I know that sounds weird, but basically in the middle of the day, usually at lunch, I think of it as my digital dessert. I have like 30 to 40 minutes where I just allow myself free reign in Screenland, you know, whatever I want to do, right? And what's cool about that is that means in the morning when I'm trying to actually work or do something that's important to me, and I have that craving, I can think to myself, I've got digital dessert coming. I actually look forward to it in a weird way. But that's been a big game changer to try to condense the distraction into one time window versus having it just like appear all day, every day.
Yeah, that takes some serious discipline though, to keep yourself on that clock.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It takes a lot of discipline. But I would say there's also, you mentioned this earlier. So there are all these screen time tactics that we just talked about, hacks, stuff like that. But the deeper thing is that for most of us, we don't really want to feel a lot of what we're feeling, the discomfort, the challenging emotions, the sometimes dark thoughts that run through at least my mind. And so really, I feel like that's the deeper issue when it comes to screen craving and screen addiction.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.